This episode of Crushed Custard is dedicated to the Thin Lizzy album Jailbreak.
Good evening. Tonight, the album that we're going to look at in a little bit of detail is this one, Jailbreak by Thin Lizzy. Came out in 1976. Gatefold, inside sleeve. There's the back sleeve. Now this is an album that I've had in my collection since day one, really. One of the first albums that I bought, and it's remained a regular spinner ever since. So let's take a look at it in a little more detail. Now, to be fair, the first two albums of the Scott Gore and Brian Robertson era of Thin Lizzy hadn't really set the world on fire. Nightlife in 1974 and Fighting in 1975. They certainly weren't held in the high regard they are now back then, so the pressure was really on for Thin Lizzy to deliver something of a breakthrough top drawer album. Now, to be fair, Fighting had scrambled into the low echelons of the chart, something which none of the previous albums had managed to do, but the singles had totally bombed out, and it was only the high profile touring and the reputation that they built as a live outfit that was really keeping them in the bracket above the ordinary. Now, the band hadn't been happy with the production of the Nightlife album, and so Phil Lynott had decided to produce the follow-up Fighting on his own. However, that didn't quite work as well as it might have been hoped as well, and they decided then there was a need for some recording output that could really sort of match their live performances, so it was time to bring somebody else in. Now, the person that they chose was the former Who producer John Alcock, and after another high-profile tour, this time they went out with Status Quo. They went off into the Rampart Studios in London to begin work on what was to become one of their most famous albums, Jailbreak, in December 1975. Now, initially, Alcott wasn't overly impressed with the material they've got, and whilst he accepted that he showed promise, he began suggesting ways in which the songs could be fine-tuned, given a little bit more polish and made slightly more commercial. Now, whereas Phil Lynott was quite open to these suggestions and keen to learn anything that could help him to become a better writer, he didn't necessarily sit well with the rest of the band. In particular, Brian Robertson, and he was particularly unhappy with quite a few of Alcock's suggestions. One of which was to bring in some session musicians to augment the sound. Now, he didn't fancy that idea at all, and he subsequently refused to play on one of the tracks, Running Back. Onto the album itself, then what kicks off, of course, with the classic title track, Jailbreak. On its powerful start, it literally just grabs your attention straight away, and almost throws you up against a wall, like a scene from a barroom brawl. The song itself is a typical menacing, tough guy lyric from Phil Lynott over a chugging twin guitar harmony and some nice wah-wah effects from Robertson. It's straight out of the top drawer, and it's one of those classic rock tunes that you never tire of, and the minute you hear the opening few notes, you know exactly what it is. One of the things that a lot of people probably don't know about it is that it was the inspiration for the track Burning Sky, which Bad Company recorded and used as the title track of their 1977 album, where the lyric had got a similar type of theme. Obviously, Jailbreak is, for many people, and probably for me as well, the best track on the album, and it's never a bad way to start your album, is it, with one of the better tracks. After we've had that opener, we go on to the next track, which is a track called Angel of the Coast, and after that hard riffing of the opener, this one has got an almost funky jazz-like riff in places, and it's one of Lynott's great storytelling lyrical masterpieces, really. A jazzy solo and a riff, and in places that sort of reminds me of early Trapeze, or even maybe the Doobie Brothers in places. However, the most infectious riff on the album follows in the shape of the track Running Back, the one that Brian Robertson refused to play on. And this was obviously one that caused all the trouble with Alcott, because he scrapped the bluesy version that Robertson had recorded and replaced it with Tim Hinckley on the keyboards and harmonica. To say Robertson wasn't happy is a bit of an understatement, and he just completely and utterly refused to play on it, although bizarrely he did record it on his own solo album many, many years later. To be honest, I think I'm kind of in Alcock's corner here because it does give it a great sort of sound and makes it a little bit different. The keyboard riff, bizarrely, is not dissimilar to a Frankie Miller track called Mailbox, which was on his first album. Later on, of course, Brian Robertson joined Frankie Miller's band and they played Mailbox live, and then when Brian Robertson recorded his solo album, Diamonds and Dirt, I think it was called, he, on that album, not only recorded a cover version of Mailbox, but he also did his own version of Running Back. So, a little bit of an interlude sort of story there. Initially, that track as well was also going to be the lead-off single, but that idea was changed. I think it probably would have done quite well, but I don't think we can really argue with the single choices they made in the end. And in those days, 2 singles per album was pretty much all you were looking for. You really weren't looking to put out 3 or 4. So it's in the pecking order. It probably is right that it didn't actually come out as a single in the end. Romeo and the Lonely Girl is next, and that's another one with a great bouncy jazzy riff and some great Phil Lynott lyrics, although even I'm going to say I think he's pushing it a bit, rhyming Romeo with on his ownio. I mean, that's just maybe going just a little bit too far, but pushing it just that little bit too much. The fast solo on that, though, is probably the highlight of the track, though. It's far more than just a finish. It's a great, great song. 5th and final track on side 1 of the album is Warriors, and that's much, much heavier, and it's more in the mould of the opening track. It's almost like you've got 2 sort of really heavy tracks to start and end the side, and then you've got the 3 sort of jazzier, more experimental, lighter ones in between. On this track, Lynott's almost doing a sort of Jimi Hendrix impression vocally, and although the guitar is obviously not a patch on Hendrix, the solo has that kind of feel about it as well. Okay, moving on to side 2. Well, side 2 kicks off with a track that everybody in the world knows, don't they? An unmistakable riff, that machine gun riffing sound of The Boys Are Back in Town, a song that inspired more than one generation to get their best gear on a Friday or Saturday night and go strutting it around the town. Nothing needs to be said about it. If you haven't heard The Boys Are Back in Town, or where have you been for the last 40, 50 years or whatever it is, absolute classic. It's a staple for all those Dad's Best Song albums, isn't it? The greatest rock albums ever, the greatest this album ever, the greatest driving album ever, the greatest everything album. It's just a great rock song. It's up there in the same bracket as the likes of All Right Now, Black Knight, Wishing Well, Paranoid, and all those Boston tracks and all those things. It's just a rock classic and is superb. The problem you've got when you write a song, which obviously they didn't know at the time was going to become such a rock classic, is what comes after it. It's always going to be a little bit of an anticlimax, isn't it? And kind of, fortunately for Thin Lizzy, the weakest track on the album, in my opinion, is the one that follows it. So it's not like it's a good track that's been wasted. That track is Fight or Fall. Lynott still gives a fine vocal, and the laid back solo is quite nice, but it just meanders a little bit and fails to hold the attention. But again, that could be more due to following The Boys Are Back in Town, so maybe it's a case of listening now in these days of CD and stuff. It's easier to listen to them in a different order, isn't it? And maybe give that one a chance without listening to The Boys Are Back in Town first, and it might come out a little bit better. After that, we get the Cowboy song, and this is often cited by many Thin Lizzy fans as one of their favourite songs, and it's indeed up there amongst the best tracks on the album. Lynott again providing a superb vocal, which he always did, and the slower paced intro again reminds me of his mate Frankie Miller, and those two used to chat together quite a lot, so they obviously inspired each other as well. It's the longest track on the album, and it features some great guitar work throughout from both guitar players. It actually made its way into the live set before the studio was recorded, and an early version of it is available on the UK Tour 75 album. The album closes with the 5th of the 9 tracks that found its way onto the live set, and subsequently the album Live and Dangerous, of course. Is Emerald. It's one of Thin Lizzy's most recognisable and loved tracks, and it remained in the live set right until the end of Thin Lizzy, and it features some great guitar dueling as well as a menacing, passion-filled, heartfelt vocal from Lynette. It's probably one of the best examples of that trademark Thin Lizzy double guitar sound. The only slight problem for me now is after you've heard the live versions, whether that be on the Live and Dangerous album or subsequent other albums that have come out, or fortunate enough to see them perform it live as I did on several occasions, the studio version just sounds a little bit restrained, a little bit tame in comparison to those live versions. But that happens with quite a lot of rock tracks, doesn't it? And it doesn't take anything away from it. If you'd never heard the live one, you would still think this was a classic track. And so there you go. So we're almost nitpicking, I suppose, by suggesting that it's not as good as the live version. It's still a belting way to it, an absolute classic rock album. So Jailbreak was completed in January 1976, and it was unleashed on the public towards the end of March in that same year. With its sci-fi type sleeve and the story on the back cover, it appeared to many people to be some sort of a concept album, but although there are linking themes and storytelling elements in some of the songs, the cover only really refers to the title track, and it's just a normal rock album really, without any of that concept business involved. On the back of the success of the single release of The Boys Are Back in Town, it very quickly became the band's best-selling album, and it is still, along with Black Rose, regularly cited by fans of Thin Lizzy as the two finest albums. I certainly wouldn't disagree with that. The trademark dual guitar sound had by this release been honed to perfection and with a constant touring, but it was far more than just twin heavy rock guitars. There are elements of numerous styles going on with the jazzy undertones and the little melodies, the little quirks here and there, and all that light poppy sound coming in now and again as well. Lynette's vocals and storytelling lyrics put him on a higher level than most rock frontmen, and he's quite often overlooked what a seriously good bass player he was as well, not just a singer. Add to that Brian Downey's no-nonsense tight drumming and that little bit of fairy dust that was added by John Alcock, and you have what is now rightly referred to as a classic rock album. In truth, Thin Lizzy were always better live than they were in the studio, but if you're only going to own one Thin Lizzy studio album, I would suggest that it probably ought to be this one or Black Rose. In fact, I would suggest you probably seriously consider getting both of them. That was Jailbreak then. Thin Lizzy, a classic album which I bought right at the beginning of my sort of record collecting days at the ripe old age of 16 or 17 or whatever it was. And I'm still listening to regularly now, never tire of it, always puts a smile on your face, and it's one of those go-to albums, isn't it? If you're feeling like you don't really fancy it when you're supposed to be going out and you think, I'm going to need to get myself in the mood to go out, you stick Jailbreak on and you're out ready, rocking for the night. See you next time.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please consider pressing the like or subscribe button as it helps the channel to grow. See you soon.